Getting started. Let's start your Rust journey. There's a lot to learn, but every journey starts somewhere. In this chapter, we'll discuss installing Rust on Linux, Mac OS, and Windows, writing a program that prints Hello World, using Cargo, Rust's package manager and build system, installation. The first step is to install Rust. We'll download Rust through RustUp, a command line tool for managing Rust versions and associated tools. You'll need an internet connection for the download. The following steps install the latest stable version of the Rust compiler. Rust stability guarantees ensure that all the examples in the book that compile will continue to compile with newer Rust versions. The output might differ slightly between versions because Rust often improves error messages and warnings. In other words, any newer stable version of Rust you install using these steps should work as expected with the content of this book. Command line notation. In this chapter and throughout the book, we'll show some commands used in the terminal. Lines that you should enter in a terminal all start with $. You don't need to type the $character. It's the command line prompt shown to indicate the start of each command. Lines that don't start with dollars typically show the output of the previous command. Additionally, PowerShell-specific examples will use rather than dollars. Installing RustUp on Linux or Mac OS. If you're using Linux or Mac OS, open a terminal and enter the following command. The command downloads a script and starts the installation of the RustUp tool, which installs the latest stable version of Rust. You might be prompted for your password. If the install is successful, the following line will appear. You will also need a linker, which is a program that Rust uses to join its compiled outputs into one file. It is likely you already have one. If you get linker errors, you should install a C compiler, which will typically include a linker. A C compiler is also useful because some common Rust packages depend on C code and will need a C compiler. On Mac OS, you can get a C compiler by running. Linux users should generally install GCC or Clang according to their distribution's documentation. For example, if you use Ubuntu, you can install the Build Essential package. Installing RustUp on Windows. Go to rustlang.org Tools Install and follow the instructions for installing Rust. At some point in the installation, you'll be prompted to install Visual Studio. This provides a linker and the native libraries needed to compile programs. If you need more help with this step, see rustlang.github.io RustUp installation Windows mess VC. HTML. The rest of this book uses commands that work in both CMD.exe and PowerShell. If there are specific differences, we'll explain which to use. Troubleshooting. To check whether you have Rust installed correctly, open a shell and enter this line. You should see the version number, commit hash, and commit date for the latest stable version that has been released in the following format. If you see this information, you have installed Rust successfully. If you don't see this information, check that Rust is in your %path% system variable as follows. In Windows CMD, use. If that's all correct and Rust still isn't working, there are a number of places you can get help. Find out how to get in touch with other Rustations, a silly nickname we call ourselves, on the community page, updating and uninstalling. Once Rust is installed via RustUp, updating to a newly released version is easy. From your shell, run the following update script. To uninstall Rust and RustUp, run the following uninstall script from your shell. Local documentation. The installation of Rust also includes a local copy of the documentation so that you can read it offline. Run RustUpDoc to open the local documentation in your browser. Anytime a type or function is provided by the standard library and you're not sure what it does or how to use it, use the Application Programming Interface (API) documentation to find out. Hello World. Now that you've installed Rust, it's time to write your first Rust program. It's traditional when learning a new language to write a little program that prints the text, Hello World, to the screen. So we'll do the same here. Note, this book assumes basic familiarity with the command line. Rust makes no specific demands about your editing or tooling or where your code lives. So, if you prefer to use an integrated development environment, IDE, instead of the command line, feel free to use your favorite IDE. Many IDEs now have some degree of Rust support. Check the IDE's documentation for details. The Rust team has been focusing on enabling great IDE support via Rust Analyzer. See Appendix D for more details. Creating a project directory. You'll start by making a directory to store your Rust code. It doesn't matter to Rust where your code lives, but for the exercises and projects in this book, we suggest making a projects directory in your home directory and keeping all your projects there. Open a terminal and enter the following commands to make a projects directory and a directory for the Hello World project within the projects directory. For Linux, Mac OS, and PowerShell on Windows, enter this. For Windows CMD, enter this. Writing and running a Rust program. Next, make a new source file and call it main.rs. Rust files always end with the .rs extension. If you're using more than one word in your file name, the convention is to use an underscore to separate them. For example, use helloworld.rs rather than helloworld.rs. Now open the main.rs file you just created and enter the code in listing 1-1. File name main.rs. Save the file and go back to your terminal window in the HAL Projects Hello World directory. On Linux or Mac OS, enter the following commands to compile and run the file. On Windows, enter the command main-x instead of /main. Regardless of your operating system, the string Hello World should print to the terminal. If you don't see this output, refer back to the troubleshooting part of the installation section for ways to get help. If Hello World did print, congratulations! You've officially written a Rust program. That makes you a Rust programmer. Welcome, Anatomy of a Rust program. Let's review this Hello World program in detail. Here's the first piece of the puzzle. These lines define a function named main. The main function is special. It is always the first code that runs in every executable Rust program. Here, the first line declares a function named main that has no parameters and returns nothing. If there were parameters, they would go inside the parentheses. The function body is wrapped in toward. Rust requires curly brackets around all function bodies. It's good style to place the opening curly bracket on the same line as the function declaration, adding one space in between. Note, if you want to stick to a standard style across Rust projects, you can use an automatic formatter tool called Rust FME to format your code in a particular style. More on Rust FMT in Appendix D. The Rust team has included this tool with the standard Rust distribution, as RustTC is, so it should already be installed on your computer. The body of the main function holds the following code. This line does all the work in this little program. It prints text to the screen. There are four important details to notice here. First, Rust style is to indent with four spaces, not a tab. Second, println calls a Rust macro. If it had called a function instead, it would be entered as println without the. We'll discuss Rust macros in more detail in Chapter 19. For now, you just need to know that using a means that you're calling a macro instead of a normal function and that macros don't always follow the same rules as functions. Third, you see the hello world string. We pass this string as an argument to println, and the string is printed to the screen. Fourth, we end the line with a semicolon, as which indicates that this expression is over and the next one is ready to begin. Most lines of Rust code end with a semicolon. Compiling and running are separate steps. You've just run a newly created program, so let's examine each step in the process. Before running a Rust program, you must compile it using the Rust compiler by entering the rustcc command and passing it the name of your source file, like this. If you have a C or C++ background, you'll notice that this is similar to GCC or Clang. After compiling successfully, Rust outputs a binary executable. On Linux, macOS, and PowerShell on Windows, you can see the executable by entering the ls command in your shell. On Linux and macOS, you'll see two files. With PowerShell on Windows, you'll see the same three files that you would see using CMD. With CMD on Windows, you would enter the following. This shows the source code file with the .rs extension, the executable file, main.exe on Windows, but main on all other platforms, and, when using Windows, a file containing debugging information with the PDB extension. From here, you run the main or main.exe file like this. If your main.rs is your Hello World program, this line prints Hello World to your terminal. If you're more familiar with a dynamic language, such as Ruby, Python, or JavaScript, you might not be used to compiling and running a program as separate steps. Rust is an ahead-of-time compiled language, meaning you can compile a program and give the executable to someone else, and they can run it even without having Rust installed. If you give someone a .rb, .py, or JS file, they need to have a Ruby, Python, or JavaScript implementation installed, respectively. But in those languages, you only need one command to compile and run your program. Everything is a trade-off in language design. Just compiling with RustCC is fine for simple programs. But as your project grows, you'll want to manage all the options and make it easy to share your code. Next, we'll introduce you to the Cargo tool, which will help you write real-world Rust programs.